Ilgin, and I will be your moderator for today's event. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Paul and Ruslan. And welcome to the webinar again. Let's get started. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Paul Gruber. I just wanted to start off. Today we're going to talk about aligning second language acquisition, or SLA theory, with listening theory and practice. And our subtitle is Listening to Symbiotic Resources, which is a way of thinking of what's happening with current or contemporary SLA theory. Next slide, please. So just a fairly quick overview. I just really wanted to briefly touch on a theory of language. My thinking there was only to give an idea that there's many, many ways to think of language, and not simply only one way or only one, I suppose, common way that we think of it. And that'll help you kind of expand. Next, we're going to talk about contemporary SLA, or second language acquisition theory, particularly with just one key reference in the interest of time. And then what is symbiotic resources? Why is video text or video clips being used more and more in listening? Some practical lesson plans, some sample listening activities that Russ has created, and then some suggestions for action research. Please, during the presentation, write some chat and things like that. And wonderful to see you from Chile, from Peru, from the Philippines, from New Zealand, and of course from Brazil too, and India. Thanks, Sana. So first, a personal note. Myself, I wanted to say I came to listening, perhaps like many of you, we weren't born to be listening researchers or listening instructors, but what I wanted to inform you is that my area of listening, I came from a background in journalism. My original degree is in journalism, particularly in television production. So that may help you kind of understand. I went to my master's degrees from UCLA. I did not take the class in second language acquisition. I got what I call an exemption for taking SLA class. And I took a class in cinema theory or film theory to give you an idea of how I came to listening. And then a single quote really inspired me when I considered doing my master's and then PhD research. It's a single quote, and I wanted us today as people interested in listening to think of listening as this quote: listening is the basis for action. So as I raised my son, I'd always tell him, if you don't listen, you can't act. You're just going to sit there. And I think I wanted us to start thinking listening is actually a really exciting and interactive and interpretive kind of act. And it's a very, very social act. We're currently writing a paper on listening as a social activity, and then thinking about that. Sorry, I have forgotten where the source of that quote is, but I still think of it as often. And I just wanted to start this saying, I think it should inspire us as listening researchers, as listening instructors, that really what we're trying to do is engage students in action or enable them to act and, in a sense, get on with their lives and get on with their communicative activities. So let's go to the next slide. This is a fairly quick one. This Valdez, Kibler, and Waukee, there actually was published under TESOL International Association. So you can find it there. And as part of TESOL is really one of the reasons we wanted to use it. But they identify these 4 major views of language that now dominate English language instruction throughout North American context. So there's these kind of early formal theories, grammar, translation, and audiolingualism. We tend not to use them so much, but myself as a Peace Corps volunteer in the early 80s in West Africa, a lot of the Africans and a lot of the language instruction in Africa at the time was dominated by grammar translation and audiolingualism. And we're still seeing, if not parts of the world being dominated by those that are still dominated by grammar translation as a way, but there's still traces of that in a lot of our thinking. The next way is this kind of cognitive theories. And again, parallel in my own career, going from a Peace Corps volunteer as an English instructor in West Africa and learning audiolingualism as my method of instruction. And then my master's degree, my first topic was learning strategies approach to listening. So this has a really strong basis in cognitive theories. If the theory is, if we understand what the brain is doing, and that listening is such a complex act, that in fact, understanding psychological or cognitive approaches, we will in fact become better listening instructors and better listening researchers. If I can say, a lot of our listening research is still kind of centered around cognitive theories. My own PhD was considered about short-term memory, the conflict, for example, between seeing and speaking and listening, and what may tax the master part of your brain. And then again, the first 6 months of my PhD, I looked at learning strategies. I eventually abandoned it because it was, in a sense, too complicated, too fussy. I couldn't think of how I was going to admit or how to explain it to students, that I really was looking at them and trying to, in a sense, affect their brains. Another way that dominates language instruction across North America are, of course, functional. This is a theoretical way to say English for specific purposes or communicative language teaching. And then that last one, systemic functional linguistics. That systemic functional linguistics can, in a sense, go into this category, or can start going into social cultural theories. So social cultural theories, as you probably are aware, is what we try to get in getting students to think of the context or think of the culture. And then ourselves as language teachers and language learners, we try to imbue culture and experience and authenticity into our teaching. So that one, systemic functional linguistics, you may or may not have heard of this, but it's becoming a much more prominent way to teach or think about language. Systemic functional linguistics comes from a theoretician called Halliday. Halliday himself was an English language instructor in post-World War II China. And he was very frustrated, I suppose, with cognitive or audiolingualist approach, and started thinking of language as a way, as the functions of language. And then he developed a system that tried to think of communication, not simply language, as one way to communicate. And I'll keep talking about that as we go on. So that next slide. So as I just noted, I don't deeply know second language acquisition theory, but I could say to you as a group of listeners, there is hardly, if almost non-existent, research on the use of listening in second language acquisition. So I'm being a bit critical here, but most of what we know about second language acquisition comes from writing or perhaps speaking, but we do not have SLA in listening. And if you think about that, it's, well, if listening is such a dominant skill, then why hasn't it been, I suppose, brought much more together with listening theory? So this Douglas Fir group then gives us, I suppose, as listening people, an entry point. So this Douglas Fir group is a prominent team of experts. You can look up, we put the reference there at the end of these slides. There's a prominent team of experts. They called the Douglas Fir group because they met at the AAAL, the American Association of Applied Linguists. If you've been there in Portland, they have a hotel. One of the rooms in the hotel is called the Douglas Fir Room. They met there and talked during this conference, and then came together and put together this new theory on SLA. The title of the paper and the title of what their thrust is Transdisciplinary Framework for SLA in a Multilingual World. So that transdisciplinary, so not cross-disciplinary, not interdisciplinary, but transdisciplinary, The phrase transdisciplinary is a key phrase. It tries to think of what we can take from a range of I suppose, disciplines and think of a new way of going across or beyond the disciplines so that each discipline can grab something from it. And this is what they did. They have a three-part framework with 10, I suppose, propositions, and we'll be talking about this one. The reason they wrote this paper was they explicitly sought or seek to recognize learner mobility, global diversity, and new technology. So second language acquisition, Carol Chappell has written a book, I suppose, about 2000, 2001, the early 2000s called CASR, Computer Assisted Second Language Acquisition Research. And now start thinking CASLR, Computer Assisted Second Language Acquisition, with this kind of more explicit new technology. So no longer separate call away from SLA or SLA away from technology, but simply infuse the two so that technology is part and parcel of contemporary applied linguistics. Technology is part and parcel of everything that we do now. Technology is fundamental to the way we think of language. And with a focus on our purposes today, these experts write that, and this is the provocative quote that I myself with my students say, well, what does this mean? Language learning is semiotic learning. So what does that mean? And what does it have to do with listening? So let's think about that for a moment. Any comments or, just as we're interacting here, what does it mean? Language learning is semiotic learning. I just want you to sit down and think about it for a moment. What's semiotic learning? And let's just slow down for just a second. What does that have to do with listening? What does semiotics, which is the study of visuals, have to do with listening? Any comments in the chat or any comments anyone wants to make? Well, if not, we'll just continue then. So at the heart of this three-tier framework is Symbiotic Resources. So let's think about it. Let's move on to the next slide and I'll look at it. So Louise is writing, successfully transferring the image to the verbal. There's a timing issue with watching and listening. I think we're all missing many semiotic cues. So let's think about it here. And I hope you can see this graphic. It's part of this Douglas Fru group, which again, the reference is here. But really, let's look at this graphic from the Douglas Fru group in terms of listening. So think about it for a moment. At the heart of that is listening, is individuals engaging with others. That's why we listen. So we can listen to what they're thinking. We can listen to how we're engaging. So I really want us to start thinking that listening at the core here is a social activity. It's not individuals engaging with their brains. Further down on that graphic is neurobiological mechanisms and cognitive capacities. But us as language teachers are really concerned about how our students engage and learn and interact. Remember those 4 different dominant ways of teaching language. Currently, many of us have moved to social cultural views of language. Therefore, let's think of listening rather than a cognitive approach. Let's think of listening more as a social cultural approach, so engaging with others. So often many of us are in multilingual contexts of action and interaction, and we have multilingual repertoires. We borrow words, we distort words, we pronounce words in different ways for different reasons. And then that 3-tier system, I'll just talk about it for example. So that macro level is ideological structures. So this is belief systems or cultural values or political values, religious or economic values. We don't tend to do this in listening class so much, but listening is affected by ideology. So your political values or your religious values may affect, and in fact are encircled by how you interact with others. I think this is a good insight for us as listening researchers and listening teachers, that perhaps we should talk about the macro level of ideology as we begin to teach listening, as opposed to start talking about short-term memory and cognitive control. Think about the cultural values. In this way, we're now starting to engage in a larger area of applied linguistics. That kind of Pennycook view of of applied linguistics. Applied linguistics as engaged in political issues, applied linguistics as engaged in social justice and economic values. At that second tier, the meso level, this is now social cultural institutions and communities. So now we have social identities. So the way I see myself now, I just want you to think of this for a moment, affects the way I listen and learn. So what's my investment, or my agency or my power? And myself as a professor or an associate professor, sometimes I don't have to listen because I have the power to ignore my students. That's my social identity. However, at a barbecue with my friends, I have less power and I'm seen more equal. Therefore, if I don't listen, I'm considered rude. But as a professor, I may be considered a power play. I'm not listening, I'm leaving you. So therefore, I have a social identity both in my career, my investment, my agency, my power. But of course, I have a neighborhood, I have a social organization, I have a family and schools. So I just wanted to bring that out as another aspect that affects listening now. I just really want to make the point today that listening is a social activity. It's not primarily a cognitive activity. I think we keep getting stuck in that second tier of different ways to approach language, and we keep getting stuck, I suppose, in cognitive approaches. And finally now, hopefully not being too boring, but that micro level of social activity. So we have semiotic resources. So linguistic, prosodic, interactional. And of course, this is our second part of our talk here was semiotic resources. So listening to semiotic resources. So linguistic, prosodic, interactional, nonverbal, graphic, pictorial, auditory, and artifactual. Please understand now that auditory is only one resource that I do in social activities. So for us, if we overemphasize audio resources in listening, I think we're distorting the ability of listeners then to engage in prosodic resource, interactional resources. And then we're also discounting the meso level of agency and power. We're also discounting the macro level of ideological structures. We as listening instructors then have a much richer repertoire to make our classes much more exciting and to engage this overall, these three circles in all of these semiotic resources to really get our students and help our students to individuals engaging with others. Good listeners engage. We know that. Good listeners engage. We don't know if good listeners have superior memories. We don't know if good listeners have processing speed. It's at the neurobiological mechanisms. That may be true, but we are language instructors looking to help people engage in a complex world of micro, meso, and macro structures in communities and activities that can inform and energize the way we teach listening. So let's go on to the next slide. So briefly, that micro level and then these semiotic resources. So briefly, structural semiotic theory is constructed of signs and signifiers. But really, so that structural linguistics contains a series of fixed elements in a set of grammar. So we can see this structural semiotic theory and structural linguistics. They tend to complement each other. But social semiotics now, so in semiotic theory, we moved away from structural semiotic theory, and that in the sense that there was one-to-one correspondence between a sign and a signifier. to think of it as a socially negotiated way of meaning. So the way I teach this in class, I hold up a book and I say, dear students, what does this mean? And they say, oh, it's an academic book. And then I slam it on the table and I say, now in our social community, it's now become an element or weapon. It can hurt somebody. So now I've changed the meaning of this book to now be a weapon. So for our community, books both signify, in a sense, academic life, but they also signify danger. And that's how symbiotic resources work. So as we know, culturally, I can do this. In some cultures, it may be wrong. I can do this, I can do this. In other cultures, I have to bow. Those are symbiotic resources that help me engage with others and help me engage culturally, help me engage ideologically. So symbiotic resources are linked conceptually to systemic functional linguistics, but really for us in this short talk, they point to the negotiated meaning of elements of communication. That's what I want to say. If we're interacting, then this can become a globe, it can become a ball, it can become blue, depending on how I want to use that to engage with you. It's not simply fixed blue ball. I can make it mean something different in conversation to my listeners. Next slide. So videos, Russ and I had particularly, I suppose, investigated this. So video clips are strong examples of bundles of symbiotic resources, and in a few minutes, we'll show you some examples of this. But the reason I'm using this term video text and not video clips is because now, as applied linguists, I can now align our work, I put out work, but our work, with writing and reading research on text and interpretation and analysis. If we use the term video clip, we're referencing, if you will, media theory or film theory. If we use the term video text, we can draw on a much richer repertoire of textual interpretation and analysis. So that's what I wanted to do. And then we'll start handing over. But as a language teacher, how can I align my listening instruction to contemporary SLA theory and indeed foster an awareness of the role of semiotic resources as my students develop their language or their language skills? And that's really what I wanted to make, this morning. How can we start thinking, wow, I'm not a cognitive, my philosophy of learning is in fact social cultural. Here's the new contemporary 2016 SLA theory. How can then I bring in an awareness of semiotic resources so that language learning is semiotic learning? Language learning is semiotic learning. It's really tough to say that, but this is 3 or 4 or 5 years old kind of theory. And again, SLA theory is now aligning with social semiotic theory. And I'm hoping that you're starting to get an idea of where contemporary listening can move that would open up a world for us of teaching culture, teaching ideology, teaching interaction, drawing on different semiotic resources. Also, my pace, my slowness, my pronunciation is a semiotic resource that affects listeners. And so if I speed up, that's a semiotic resource. I speed up for making a pedagogical point. But that's my control of resources. It's not simply auditory. I'm trying to communicate with you and develop and talk about my semiotic repertoire to help become an effective communicator. If we do that with our students, I think it would really help them. Next slide, Sam. Some practical lesson plans, and then I'll hand over to Russ and he can start talking about this, but think about it very quickly and we'll fairly move on. So listening is grounded in motivation and interest, get students involved in the process of meaning making to raise their awareness and curiosity. Currently, as far as I read, we're on our screens now, maybe 8 hours on average, up to 12 hours on average per day. The average person, The average person interacts now less than 90 minutes per day face-to-face. Average person, less than 90 minutes a day face-to-face. So we're talking about a lot of video and screen time for the average person. Practical lesson plan, create still images from video text and have students predict what will happen and then show the entire text. So I go like this, and what will Paul continue to do? Will he suddenly go like this? One of the things I do with my students is say, hey, you guys are really great. And then I have to have them understand what I'm doing with these two semiotic resources. One semiotic resource is saying you're great. The other semiotic resource is pointing down to indicate displeasure. Have students themselves identify semiotic resources from a range of video texts. They love doing this. It's really exciting. They've never thought of listening as searching for semiotic resources. They get engaged, they get motivated, they get interested, they engage with each other. Have students create misaligned semiotic resources. That's what I was saying. You're great, and then have them make a silly clip on, making this misaligned semiotic resources. They love doing that. It's really quite fun. But then they start understanding where listening can, fall apart. This is a great listening kind of class. Bring emojis into listening instruction. If you ever played what they call emoji charades, what a great way to teach listening, emoji charades. Bring examples from other countries' cultures to demonstrate particular uses of semiotic resources in context. We could all think of, this may mean something in Italy, this may mean something in Japan, this may mean something in Thailand. That's what I was thinking. And finally, my final point before I hand it over to Russ is listening instruction is cultural awareness raising and emphasizes now the social nature of listening as we help individuals engage with each other. Listening is engagement. Listening is culture. Listening is macro, meso, micro. Listening is a world that opens up. And for us as listening instructors, I can't think of a better career choice than to help people understand cultures, understand multilingual across a transdisciplinary framework for a contemporary world. On to Russ.
Thank you, Paul. So I'll, like Paul, talk briefly a little bit about my journey towards this view of contemporary SLA that Paul has just presented. I was, I think, as many of you, trained in structural linguistics, both as a language learner, myself as a non-native speaker of English, and as a language teacher. So for me, listening was always associated with auditory information processing, understanding and processing auditory information. And when I did my MA thesis and PhD dissertation, the focus was on listening, specifically on the use of visuals in listening assessment. How exactly do learners process visual information during the assessment of their listening skills? And more importantly, how that visual information affects their performance, their test performance. And if you look at research in this area, it's all based in structural linguistics. A lot of research that has been done is comparative in nature. So researchers would administer a listening test in an audio-only format to a group of learners, and then they would administer the same test that would be in a video format to another group of learners or the same group of learners, and then compare their test scores and then draw conclusions based on that. So if a group of learners performed better on a listening test that was enhanced, that had a video text in it, as opposed to an audio-only listening test, then the conclusions would be drawn that visuals affect our listening comprehension. So if they, let's say, if they performed better on such video-based listening tests, then the conclusion would be that videos or video text facilitate listening comprehension. But there is no really research on looking at what kind of visuals are there. There are some emerging studies that, for example, use eye tracking technology to look more into, first of all, how learners interact with these different types of visuals, with visual cues. But there is nothing really, really about semiotic resources. all the focus is on auditory information and visual information in general. But as Paul has demonstrated, video texts are, they're very complex concepts. So if we think as language teachers, as practitioners, those of us who teach listening, how do we apply this view of listening as a semiotic activity, as something that is not only based on that addresses the auditory aspect of listening, but more importantly, the semiotic resources? How do we draw the learner's attention to these semiotic resources? How do we develop their listening as a semiotic activity? So Paul and I had a lot of discussion as we were preparing for this session. I, in particular, found this quite a challenge for me because, as I said, as a person who was trained in structural linguistics, I kind of struggled with trying to conceptualize all of it. So Paul definitely took a lead on this presentation. I was thinking from the practitioner's perspective, what can we as language teachers do in order to draw our learners' attention to semiotic resources, to teach them to focus on semiotic resources while they engage in listening? So as someone who has some background in computer-assisted language learning and has been working with technology quite a bit, I thought of one of the tools that many of you might be familiar with, H5P, being one of the ways to create interactive videos that would encourage the learners to pay attention to these semiotic resources. A few words about H5P. It's an open source HTML5 based platform that allows people to create interactive videos. I put a link here, h5p.org. You can go and take a look, learn more about it, but I'll show you a few examples that I've created. So in particular, so H5P it's a collection, it's a panoply of these different tools. What I'm going to show is specifically interactive videos, because I think those have the potential, a strong potential for being used in listening instruction with the purpose of drawing attention to semiotic resources. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of listening activities that I created in H5P that I think can leverage to draw attention to these semiotic resources. So I will play the first one, which is it's a short 1-minute video, so bear with me. I hope you can hear the audio.
What do you wish for? Nice life? Nice things? Or do you wish for something more? A sense of purpose? Do you wish to discover a cure? To write code that cracks an unsolvable question? To further our exploration into space? Or to invent something that changes everything right here on Earth? Well, if that's your wish, make yourself ready. Because when you look back, you'll see that you didn't just make wishes, you realized them.
Okay, so what I did, what H5P allows you to do, it allows you to make the video interactive. You can embed questions into the video. You can pause the video automatically with some sort of a note or a label. Right here, you can see that this question, what do you think is the main purpose of this public service announcement? It was added by me to the video. It wasn't in the original video. And it's not the end of the video yet. So by inserting a question like this into the video, you can make the students, for example, pause and reflect on what they have just seen. If we focus only on the auditory stream, what was in this public service announcement, it doesn't give you the full picture of what this is really about. You need to, so once the students have reflected on this, if they continue watching the video, they can get the full underlying message. So you can see that the focus here is on STEM education. And then I added another question, which actually allows the students to type their response. So after they have finished watching this whole 1 minute video text, they can type their response about what kind of message this video intends to convey. So they can say like, this video intends to promote STEM education, for example. And then they click answer. That gets submitted to the instructor. So if we think about the function from the systemic functional linguistics, if we think about the meta function that this video text intends to convey, it would be related to the ideational meta function. I'll show you another clip, which is taken from the Big Bang Theory. So here the focus is a little bit different, and you will see a lot more interactivity that I added to this video text using H5P. It's a little bit longer, about 2 minutes, but.
First there was PlayStation, aka PS1. Then there's PS2, PS3, and now PS4. And that makes sense. You'd think after Xbox, there'd be Xbox 2. But no. Next came Xbox 360. And now, after 360, comes Xbox One. Why one? Maybe that's how many seconds of thought they put into naming it.
Okay, and then I embedded, you probably noticed that at the beginning there was a note at the bottom saying, pay attention to the conversation between Amy and Sheldon. So I embedded this question into the video text, which asks, which of the following adjectives best describes Sheldon's mood? So Sheldon and Amy are having this interaction. Actually, Sheldon's just talking. If, let's say, a learner chooses cheerful, which would not be the correct answer, click check. There is a prompt saying, do you think Sheldon really seems cheerful? Watch again. So when the learner clicks continue, the learner will be taken back to the beginning of the clip to rewatch this segment of the video text. I'm not going to do that, but well, actually.
First there was PlayStation.
It goes back to the beginning of the video. If the learner...
20 seconds of thought they put into naming it.
If the learner chooses the correct answer, which was frustrated, click check. So that's the correct answer. When the learner clicks continue, the video will continue playing.
Can you get the butter, please?
Yeah, however, with the Xbox One, I can control my entire entertainment system using voice commands. Up until now, I've had to use Leonard.
Then get the other one. Pass the butter.
Hang on. I don't feel like you're taking this dilemma seriously.
Fine, Sheldon. You have my undivided attention.
Okay, then I added another open-ended question that basically prompts the learner to think about, to hypothesize, to think about what might happen next. So this is an open-ended question. So they would type in their answer here, submit it, and then proceed with the video.
Okay, now, the PS4 is more angular and sleek looking.
No way!
It's true, but the larger size of the Xbox One may keep it from overheating.
Well, you wouldn't want your gaming system to overheat?
No, well, you absolutely would not. And furthermore, the Xbox One now comes with a Kinect included.
Included?
Yes!
So this is another type of a question or interaction that you can add to the video. Click on the word that best describes Amy's reaction to Sheldon's statement. So like surprise, for example, which was the correct one.
Not sold separately. Although the PS4 uses cool new GDDR5 RAM, while the Xbox One is still using the conventional DDR3 memory.
Why would they still be using DDR3? Are they nuts?
See, that's what I thought. But then they go and throw in an ES RAM buffer.
Whoa, wait a second. Who's they?
The Xbox.
You're kidding!
No, I am not. And this ES RAM buffer should totally bridge the 100 gigabit per second bandwidth gap between the two RAM types.
This is a nightmare. How will you ever make a decision?
See, I don't know. What should I do?
Please pass the butter!
Okay, and then at the end, there is another question. As you noticed, there was a leading prompts throughout this segment of the video clip, asking video text, asking basically asking the learners to think about whether Amy was really concerned about Sheldon's dilemma or she was using some other strategy. So again, just an example of how you can add interactivity to a video text to draw the learner's attention to these different semiotic resources. The tone of the voice, the use of gestures, pauses, things like that. Okay, like raised voice, yeah, banging on the table. All right, I have one more example, but I think we're kind of running out of time. Actually, let me show it, it's pretty quick. Whereas with this video text, the focus was more on the interpersonal metafunction, the interaction among these two characters. This specific video clip focuses more on gestures and body language, or what we call kinesics, and how this affects, again, listening. Oops. So I have a prompt at the beginning, pay attention to the semiotic resources used by the speaker. Which ones can you identify?
A few years ago, I began to observe something in my own behavior that made me a bit uncomfortable.
So
and that was that from the moment that I woke up to the morning, to the end of the day, my life was a series of screens. I started the day with the thing that woke me up first thing in the morning, my phone.
So and then I inserted a question about asking which semiotic resources has the speaker used so far. So he used gestures, he used tone of voice, pausing, and pacing. So all of those would be examples of semiotic resources.
And so I sat there in bed watching various cooking videos on Instagram and bouncing around between a bunch of different applications. But then it was time to get out of bed.
Okay, and then the final question here, why did the speaker point his index finger up? So the option is to signal a change in his narrative or to urge the viewer to look up. I guess the correct answer would be the first one. Again, another example of how you can add this interactivity to draw the learner's attention to different semiotic resources in a video text. All right, done with examples. So we would like to finish our presentation today, our talk, by talking a little bit about, briefly about ideas that you can use for action research. So one idea is to working with colleagues to create a classification scheme for video text selection. There are video texts that you can use that have been designed for different purposes. They are of different levels of difficulty. If we think about the visual complexity of the video texts, you can have a very simple video text where you just have a talking head of a person, like you can see me right now, just a talking head. There is nothing else happening in that video text. You can have something a lot more complex, like the example with the PSA, the public service announcement, where there was a lot of action, lots of people, lots of different angles of the camera. That example of the video text would be a lot richer and more complex if we think in terms of visual complexity. Another idea is to create a rubric for determining the level of a video text that aligns with one of the prominent assessment frameworks, such as Common European Framework of Reference or the Actual Proficiency Guidelines. When you work with video texts, you of course know that we can work not only with video texts that already exist, that are out there, that can be found on YouTube, Vimeo, or any other websites, but you can also create projects that enable your learners to create their own video texts. So that would be another example here. Create a series of student projects in which students themselves create video text to teach and learn the use of semiotic resources. And the last thing is based on these 4 views of language that Paul presented earlier today, propose a definition of listening that aligns with each view or with your own view. So listening is not just the process of understanding, processing, and interpreting auditory information. It's a the contemporary views of listening definitely take into account the nonverbal communication, all these social semiotic resources. The last thing I would like to add is that I just yesterday, literally, I looked at one of the books on nonverbal communication, published pretty recently in 2016 by Burgoon and colleagues. And in the first chapter, I was struck to learn that actually research shows that anywhere between 65 and 90% of the meaning that is conveyed during the interaction is conveyed using nonverbal content. So it's not what we hear in the auditory, it's what we see this in nonverbal communication. It's everything that we get through. The majority of the meaning that is transferred is transferred through semiotic resources, not through the auditory channels. And on this note, we're open to questions. Thank you for your attention. And I think we have about 13 minutes. Elin, how should we do it? Should we just, Paul and I go through the questions, or are you going to read them?
Thank you very much. There is a question to Paul. If you wish, you can answer the question.
There's a question on how does semiotics relate to pragmatics? Actually, there's books now. There's pragmatics of media. I mean, what do you call social media? So personally, I think the world of pragmatics and the world of semiotic resources is in fact joining themselves. Personally, I always thought of pragmatics through a semiotic or social semiotic lens. But of course, there's a whole world of pragmatic research that has its own core theory, which I'm certainly not very fluent in. But for me, I think they certainly interact and touch on each other, even though they have different bases for understanding. So,
thank you. There's one more question. What would you be an alternative to the phrase semiotic resources that we can use in our simplified feature talk?
I would just say visual elements or something like that. Or the reason I want to use the word resource is because I can interpret that element as a potential for interpretation. So you may point to something, but I could say you're being rude. So it's not necessarily a cue or a clue, but it's more of a resource for interpretation. It's open to the community to understand how they want to make sense of that element. We'll see that, for example, with masks recently. I think in America, wearing a mask is a maybe in a sense even a cultural or political statement, but the mask itself is a medical device. And so the community, some communities have reinterpreted mask in different ways. So therefore, that's a great semiotic resource that may have macro, meso, or micro implications for meaning making. That's probably a contemporary resource that we can all interpret in different ways.
Thank you. Another question is, what is the difference between nonverbal content and semiotic content?
The phrase nonverbal has been criticized in semiotics, particularly CRESS and social semiotics. It's not true. It highlights the fact that verbal is in fact primary, but that's not true. What's nonverbal? It's like the world is nonverbal, as if verbal was primary and everything not verbal was secondary. But it's crazy. Please just think of a single, that's what this Douglas Fir group offers is a single unitary theory to explain both visual and verbal elements in a context. We don't have to highlight verbal and then nonverbal. If you really think about what nonverbal means, it's like, that's kind of weird. So it's been criticized in the social semiotic literature.
I guess verbal and visual would probably be a better, if you need to use some sort of a dichotomous phrase, verbal and visual would probably be better than definitely verbal and nonverbal.
Yeah.
But semiotic is more than just visual. one of the sources that I read, they call it a vocalics, which is like the tone of voice, pitch, all of those things. They are part of socials. They're part of semiotic resources, but they are not part of visuals.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. There's one more question.
And
Can you?
then could we just stop sharing the screen? I just
Oh,
wanted to,
yeah.
Okay.
it's just yeah, that kind of opens it up for, yeah, that kind of gets it more. Thank you, Russ.
Yep. There's one more question here. Can you recommend further reading on this topic?
My favorite reading as an introductory reading is called Introduction to Multimodality. It's a fantastic text. I'll try to find it and whack it up in the check, but it's Introduction to Multimodality. It's a stunning book. I think for me, it's the best introductory text. The other prominent researcher in here, which I absolutely adore, is Günter Kress, Kress. He has an extensive bibliography. Unfortunately, he died a few years ago, which is very, very sad, I think. But fantastic researcher. He has a brilliant article that's been overlooked in our field, the connection between culture as a semiotic resource in applied linguistics. So he has a brilliant article. So Günter Kress and another one, Introduction to Multimodality. And then there's Theo van Leeuwen has a great book on social semiotics. And then there's a whole journal called, in fact, Social Semiotics, the Journal of Social Semiotics.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would like to share a screen and
Oh, yes, please. Yes.
There is no question, I guess. And there are some comments in the chat, and the participants would like to listen to you. And right, I can thank everybody for participating, and we might conclude today's online program. So today's presentation was titled as Aligning SLA with Listening Theory and Practice. And I have very special thanks to our presenters, Paul and Ross. And if there is no more question or comment, I would like to conclude the program, and you may now disconnect. Thank you very much.